In the land of Wano, where cherry blossoms dance in the wind and warriors gather, there is a man who carries 3 swords at his waist. This man is none other than Zoro, who has already infiltrated Wano. Alongside Zoro, there are other members of the crew disguised as well. Frankie posing as a carpenter, Usopp selling ointments, and Robin pretending to be a hitman. But among them, Zoro stands out as the most suave, as though he has returned to his homeland. With a pot of wine in hand, sleeves fluttering in the breeze, he raises his cup to the moon, singing songs and enjoying the moment, carrying his wine flask and heading towards a carriage, all while exuding elegance. Suddenly, a sharp sound of a sword is heard. Zoro, startled, notices a scene unfolding not far from him, a moonlit slayer in action. Zoro shouts in warning and steps forward to confront the murderer. Just as he's about to take action, the sound of whistles can be heard. The patrol officers are closing in. The murderer, seeing this, quickly retreats, leaving Zoro to take the fall. The officers, however, surround Zoro, wrongly accusing him of being the killer. A large false accusation is placed on Zoro's shoulders. Faced with the blame, Zoro, ready to draw his sword, suddenly remembers the plan from earlier. He realizes that they are undercover, and he cannot afford to be exposed before all his comrades are ready. Understanding this, Zoro reluctantly gives in and allows himself to be captured, becoming the scapegoat for the crime. Zoro is sentenced to public execution by seppuku, with a special sword reserved for such executions under the cherry blossoms. As Zoro prepares for his death in front of the public, the execution officer notices that Zoro's sword is the famous Wano blade, the akushui, which has been missing for years. The officer, drooling with desire, doesn't care where Zoro got the sword and plans to take it for himself as soon as Zoro dies. Zoro retrieves a small dagger, freeing his hands from the restraints. He reveals his upper body, marked by a large scar that cuts across his torso, one given to him by Mihawk. Zoro looks at the cherry blossoms and the dagger in his hand. He tightens his grip on the dagger, preparing to commit seppuku, the honorable death of a samurai. However, just as the dagger is about to strike his abdomen, he stops at the very last moment, realizing that the true culprit lies with the high-ranking official sitting above him. In a burst of rage, Zoro unleashes his power. His Haki surrounds the blade, and with a powerful slash, the sword releases an enormous wave of energy that tears through the air, heading straight for the officer. Before the officer can even react, he is already a corpse under Zoro's blade. This is the power of the black blade combined with Haki. By this point, Zoro has no other choice. Sorry, guards, he thinks as he takes his revenge. When Zoro leaped onto the rooftop, the battle had already ended. 2 minutes earlier, Zoro had used his seppuku blade to unleash a powerful slash, killing the official, Fugyo Daimyo, with his black sword, Akushui. By this point, Zoro didn't care about exposing himself anymore. Seeing the official killed on the spot, the remaining soldiers tried to rush towards Zoro to capture him, but they were no match for his skill. With a sharp, stylish turn, Zoro exuded a chilling aura. Facing the attacking soldiers, he moved swiftly, cutting them down one by one with precise strikes. Finally, Zoro began to use his smaller blade to torment his enemies. With one short and one long sword, resembling a pair of daggers, he spun and slashed in an elegant dance, overwhelming his opponents. However, even with these weapons in hand, Zoro knew they were not a perfect match for his full power. He quickly decided that nothing was more comfortable than wielding his 3 swords. The legendary swords, Akushui, Nidai Kitetsu, and Wado Ichimonji, could only reach their maximum potential in his hands. With his 3 swords in hand, Zoro's Haki erupted, and in an instant, he leaped into the air. His blades slashed with the force of a raging dragon, creating a massive vortex that cleared everything in its path. The destruction was swift, and in a moment, the entire area was reduced to ruins. As the dust settled, Zoro gazed up at the sky, noting that the only thing left unscathed was the weather itself. Meanwhile, Luffy was lying on the beach, fast asleep, only to be suddenly attacked by a large crab. Luffy screamed in pain, realizing that this crab might be as powerful as one of the 4 emperors. After waking up, Luffy checked to ensure his straw hat was still with him. He also noticed the bright sunlight sets, but there were no companions around. Luffy struggled to remember what had happened. As he pondered, it was as if the universe itself was laughing at him. However, this time, Luffy managed to remember. Not long ago, they had witnessed a carp climbing a river and reaching a waterfall to view the whirlpool. Just as they were about to be swallowed by the whirlpool, the Sunny was trapped and unable to escape. Sanji, ever the gentleman, wanted to take Nami and get to safety. Of course, Chopper, the little rabbit, was also involved, desperately clinging to Sanji's leg, begging to be saved. Seeing Chopper crying uncontrollably, Sanji couldn't refuse. As Sanji prepared to leap, Brook also hurried to join them, his skeletal form making it uncomfortable to move. In the end, with Sanji leaping off the ship, Luffy used his rubber body to bounce them to safety. Once everyone had escaped danger, Luffy was ready to leave. The Thousand Sunny, crafted from the world's toughest wood, seemed unlikely to be harmed. However, just as Luffy grabbed the mast to leave, he found himself tightly gripped by a massive octopus from behind, making it impossible to break free. Before he knew it, he was pulled into the sea and washed up on shore. Luffy checked his life card in his hat, unsure of where he had ended up. Though frustrated, there was nothing he could do. Just then, a massive meatball rolled out from the forest and crashed into the Sunny, which made Luffy wince in pain, feeling the loss of his ship. As soon as Luffy started to think, the heavens seemed to laugh. Suddenly, a meatball crashed onto the Sunny, which made Luffy feel a sharp pang of sympathy. Looking at the creature in front of him, it was neither a dog nor a pig, and he had no idea what it tasted like. But before Luffy could dwell on it, another figure with a long sword charged at him. Was it a Luffy warrior or a baboon? The scene turned chaotic, with two enemies suddenly fighting over food. Luffy stood there, casually watching, knowing that if he wasn't so full, none of these guys would be able to escape. Just then, two dinosaur knights emerged from the forest, aiming directly at Luffy without hesitation. A shot was fired, but Luffy had already sensed it with his Kenbunshoku Haki, observation Haki, and could briefly see the future. Without waiting, Luffy swung his rubber arm and sent the bullet flying, then rushed forward to take the fight head-on. He commented, "You guys don't follow the rules." One of them tried to fight back, but couldn't even land a hit on Luffy. As Luffy ran, it looked almost like the running style of a character from Naruto. Before the enemy could even process it, Luffy sent one flying with a mighty kick. A small child crawled out from the fallen bag, quickly hiding to watch the fight. Luffy noticed one of the attackers was commanding a baboon to fight. At that moment, Luffy, irritated, picked up a flying knife and hurled it toward the opponent, the residual force from his anger shaking the air. As the sound of the roar reverberated, Luffy turned around with an icy glare. His body surged with energy, suppressing the entire battlefield, and even the nearby lion dog seemed to submit to him. The baboon immediately knelt and acted cute, and the lion dog wagged its tail, its survival instincts kicking in. The two dinosaur knights were terrified, still wanting to appear threatening and raise their guns. However, before they could react, a little girl behind them raised a stick to hit one of the knights. Though she didn't have much strength, she could knock them down, but not kill them. Just as the knight got back up to retaliate, Luffy threw a punch, sending him flying and successfully saving the little girl. In front of the fierce Luffy, the little girl quickly raised her hands in surrender. Luffy paused, surprised. "I'm a good person. I won't do anything to you." The little girl, however, wasn't scared and came up with a bold idea. She pulled a small pellet from her cheek and walked toward the baboon, offering it to him. The baboon, without giving any face, opened his mouth and roared. The little girl quickly hid behind Luffy, afraid of being scared. Luffy muttered to himself, "What? Can't handle a little kid?" The girl wasn't intimidated, though, and tossed the pellet directly into the baboon's mouth. After eating the pellet, the baboon actually became the little girl's companion. This pellet could tame animals. Now that was truly the power of the face fruit. Luffy couldn't help but wonder if this pellet would work on Kaido. From that point on, both the baboon and the lion dog became Luffy's mounts. The little girl explained to Luffy that they were in a place called Kuri, located in Wano country. To thank Luffy for saving her, the girl decided to invite him to a meal. The child was still young and innocent, but Luffy, enjoying the moment, couldn't help but smile. Luffy's domineering aura slightly surfaced, instantly subduing the raging baboon and the lion dog. He also performed an act of kindness, rescuing a young girl named Tama. Tama had gone to the market to buy vinegar and cloth, but she was robbed by thieves on the way back. As the thieves grabbed her, spilling the vinegar and wetting the cloth, Tama was left helpless. Luckily, Luffy, with his good nature, saved her. Tama was extremely grateful to Luffy for saving her life. Seeing that Luffy was still young, she called him brother, which made Luffy feel a bit awkward, as it was the first time in his life that anyone had called him that. He couldn't help but think of his two older brothers, but who could resist such a cute little girl? And so, Luffy gained another little sister. To thank Luffy, Tama invited him to her home for a meal, but before going, they needed to hide the Sunny. So, with the lion dog carrying Tama and Luffy riding along, they made their way to Tama's house. Once there, Tama, upon learning that Luffy was a pirate, was immediately intrigued. She had always been waiting for a big brother among the pirates. As she looked at Luffy's back, she felt they were somewhat alike, both strong and gentle. Tama's dream was to one day become a dazzling female ninja, which left Luffy a little confused. He didn't know what dazzling meant, and he couldn't understand how it would help her make a living. Soon, they arrived at Tama's house, a rundown shack. Despite her young age, Tama was already very capable. She lit the stove, cooked rice, and even sliced some cucumbers. However, Luffy couldn't help but notice the shabby and unpleasant smell in the house. It was dirty, smelly, and uninviting. He was a bit of an impolite food lover in that sense. When the meal was ready, Tama served Luffy a huge bowl of rice. Luffy, wide-eyed, began eating without hesitation. Tama sat quietly watching, feeling happy to see him enjoy the food. Since she was planning to become a ninja, she needed to stay slim and light like a swallow, so she didn't eat. Everyone knew about Luffy's appetite, and one bowl was never enough. He wanted more, but there was only a limited amount of food in the house, and he had eaten it all. Apologizing, he tried to explain it was just a joke when he said he wanted another bowl, but his body was clearly honest about its needs. However, Tama hadn't eaten at all, and her stomach started growling. To avoid awkwardness, she lied that she needed to go out. Luffy, although still hungry, was thankful for Tama's hospitality. But before he could rest, the door was kicked open by a large man with a big nose. Luffy initially thought it might be Usopp, but it didn't look quite right. The man looked at Luffy, then at the empty bowl, and his anger flared. Without saying a word, he charged at Luffy with a sword. At this moment, Tama, feeling famished, went to a nearby stream and drank some water, trying to quench her hunger. She was a kind-hearted girl, and it was heart-wrenching to see her struggle. As the sounds of fighting grew louder, Luffy didn't understand why the man was so angry over a bowl of rice. But the man's rage stemmed from the fact that Tama hadn't had a proper meal for weeks. She had been weaving hats to trade for money, but it was barely enough to live on. Luffy's meal had consumed months' worth of food for Tama, and to make matters worse, it was also her 8th birthday. The food she had saved up for her birthday was all eaten by Luffy. When Luffy realized this, he understood why Tama hadn't eaten. It was all set aside for him. Tama rushed back and quickly explained that it was her own choice to give him the food. She then knelt down and begged her master to spare Luffy. As she spoke, she fainted from exhaustion. The master immediately realized that Tama had drunk water from the river to suppress her hunger, but the water had been contaminated by waste from nearby factories. For a child, it was like poison. Tama didn't want to leave because she was waiting for a promise from a big brother. The person she was waiting for was... What kind of promise would make a little girl willingly stay on this barren, polluted land? Hungry, she would drink contaminated river water, and even if she had nothing to eat, she would still want to repay Luffy for saving her life. It was because of this promise, a promise with someone named Ace. When Luffy heard the name Ace, he too was shaken. He understood exactly what it meant. Looking at the seriously ill Tama, he asked, "Are you waiting for Porcus D, Ace?" Upon hearing Ace's name, a smile appeared on Tama's face, but then she suddenly froze when Luffy calmly said, "Ace, he's already dead." The words, as brief as they were, struck Tama like a thunderbolt, piercing her heart. She couldn't believe her ears, and she refused to accept what Luffy had said. Her shock quickly turned into despair. She looked at Luffy's calm expression, but who could know the immense pain and sorrow Luffy was enduring inside? It took him an immense amount of courage to say those words so calmly. Luffy had grown so much over the years, but this matter had broken Tama completely. Tama's heart was shattered. "You're lying! You're lying!" She screamed in unbearable agony. Her heart-wrenching cries echoed throughout the bamboo forest, and in her grief, she fainted. The master scolded Luffy, wondering how he could so calmly speak such cruel words. Though it was the truth, Ace was indeed dead. Luffy still had to explain to Tama that no matter how long she waited, Ace would never come back. Luffy tried to persuade the master to take Tama to a better place to live, but the master had his own person to wait for. This village was originally called Benri Village, where the villagers had been living off weaving straw hats for generations. But a year ago, Kaido's army attacked the village, capturing a pirate named X. Drake. They defeated all the village's samurai, turning the village into a wasteland. Kaido's influence spread throughout the entire Wano country, making life unbearable for the people. Only the flower capital, where the Shogun Orochi resided, still had a semblance of prosperity. The rest of the country had either become a lawless wasteland or a weapon factory for Kaido. Ace's appearance had brought a glimmer of hope to the villagers. Despite the poverty and frequent deaths from hunger, when Ace was washed ashore, the villagers took all the food and water from him. Only after the villagers had eaten it all did Ace manage to escape. The villagers expected furious revenge, but they were shocked to find that Ace was incredibly kind. He helped them rebuild their lives. Although he had only stayed for a few weeks, he had grown close to Tama, teaching her how to weave straw hats. The hat that Tama made for little oars must have been learned during this time. Hearing about Ace's time in this village, Luffy couldn't help but smile. His brother had always been such a gentle person. Looking at the ruined village ahead, the very place where Ace had lived and protected, Luffy thought to himself that he had to protect it too, for Ace. Luffy let out a mischievous laugh as he tucked the cursed sword, the second-generation Kitetsu, into his possession. At this point, Luffy had made up his mind to protect the land that Ace had once guarded, and to repay O-Tama for the meal she had given him. Before setting off, Luffy's bright clothing drew too much attention, so his master, the big lick dog, prepared a samurai kimono for him. The handsome samurai Luffy made his debut, though he preferred armor over a kimono. As the two were talking, a long sword appeared above the house, surrounded by a sinister aura. Luffy, using his observation Haki, froze for a moment as he sensed its presence. With a grin, he casually grabbed the sword and tucked it into his bosom, further cementing his samurai-like appearance. Without waiting for his master's objections, Luffy picked up O-Tama and started to leave. Seeing the sword disappear with Luffy, the big lick dog master quickly tried to stop him. It wasn't that he was unwilling to part with it, but the sword was cursed. It was forged by his ancestor, the legendary craftsman Kuchu, and was part of the 21 Great Swords. This particular blade was Gintetsu, one of the famous swords in the world. Among the excellent weapons, some were called the Ryo High Swords, while the top-tier ones were categorized into 21 Great Swords and 12 Supreme Swords. Gintetsu was among the select few that were highly regarded. Before the master could finish explaining, Luffy was already long gone. The master hurriedly chased after him, continuing to explain the sword's peculiarities. Luffy, noticing that the sword didn't meet his standards, casually decided to take it. The master, with a long nose, tried to refuse, but Luffy was persistent, grabbing the old man by the nose and tossing him aside. With no way to stop him, the master shouted a reminder, "Make sure you return the sword once you're done." But Luffy, already out of earshot, didn't respond. Luffy, unable to go to the town by himself, had the lion dog come to serve as his mount. Luffy thoughtfully placed his straw hat on O-Tama's head. However, when O-Tama woke up, a flood of sadness overwhelmed her. She immediately began hitting Luffy, calling him a liar. Luffy understood the pain she was feeling. Ace was dead, and he would never return. Though O-Tama could not accept the truth, she was devastated by the loss. She had been promised that Ace would return, but now that hope had been shattered, leaving her heartbroken and furious. She vented her grief on Luffy, though she would never understand that Luffy was Ace's first true brother. Luffy didn't try to explain. He allowed O-Tama to vent her emotions, pulling at him and expressing her sorrow. Before long, they passed through a bamboo forest, only for Luffy to be stunned by the sight that awaited them. The landscape was desolate, the land polluted, and there were weapon factories everywhere. Even the sky was darkened by the smog. This was the true face of Kaido's control over Wano, turning the country into his war machine. Amidst this wasteland, Zoro was leisurely roasting fish and waiting for meat to cook. He was nearly missing only one thing: axe, shui. Just then, Zoro sensed a sudden change in the atmosphere. With a start, he looked up and asked, "Wait, did someone say there's alcohol?" The sword of the fire dragon, infused with 9-colored Haki, suddenly radiated a powerful aura. "Is there alcohol?" Zoro asked, as it turned out that Kaido's subordinates were up to no good, bullying a woman who was the wife of one of the guards. In a critical moment, a figure rushed over. Upon closer inspection, it was none other than Zoro. With a single strike, he sent the two men flying, and in a calm voice, he told the woman to step back. The two men, now on the ground, recognized Zoro and gasped, "Isn't this the same Zoro who caused a ruckus at New Lake not long ago?" Zoro, however, wasn't interested in them. He had his eyes on the fine liquor nearby. He quickly dispatched the two enemies in one swift move, and before they even had a chance to react, they were taken down by a single slash. The minor thugs never stood a chance against Zoro's swordsmanship. After the quick battle, Zoro grabbed the wine and started drinking, unfazed. The woman, grateful for Zoro's help, tried to thank him, but Zoro waved it off, saying, "If you really want to thank me, just give me the whole barrel of wine." Just as they were talking, Luffy from a distance spotted Zoro. That figure looked familiar, and upon getting a closer look, Luffy's face turned bright red. "Is that Zoro?" Luffy immediately shouted and ran toward him. Zoro was equally surprised and excited, calling out Luffy's name. When the two finally met, Luffy jumped straight into Zoro's arms, nearly knocking him over. Zoro, still trying to catch his breath, managed to pull his head out and grin. "Long time no see, Luffy." The two shared a heartfelt reunion, although the rest of their friends had scattered. But Luffy didn't care about that. He was more focused on the smell of meat in the air. He quickly grabbed the food, but Zoro, bragging a bit, explained that the fish and animals around here were easy to catch, and there was no need to worry about food. Luffy, however, had already figured out the danger. These animals had been tainted by the nearby factories and polluted waste, making them toxic. Despite knowing this, Luffy didn't hesitate and dug in, exclaiming, "It's really delicious!" Zoro soon realized why his stomach hurt after eating. The food was toxic. But there was no time to dwell on that. They needed to find a doctor for O-Tama. Suddenly, as Luffy continued eating, he froze. His Haki surged and his instincts kicked in. Enemies incoming! Luffy quickly drew the second-generation Gentetsu, his observation Haki alerting him to the danger. Zoro, noticing the sword, immediately recognized its power. "That sword! Let me take a look," he said, intrigued by its presence.